Now to tonight's guest. A few weeks ago, NASA climate scientist James Hansen and two of his colleagues published a new study in PNAS, the official journal of the US Academy of Science, which Hansen says contains proof that extreme weather events in the last 10 years, including the European heat wave of 2003, the Russian heat wave of 2010, and last year's terrible droughts in Texas and Oklahoma, were directly linked to global warming. Proof, if you like, that climate change is actually happening now. Now comes worrying new data about the extent of this summer's Arctic sea ice melt and scientific fears that the ice cover could be broken up and gone by 2015. Well, Heidi Cullen is the chief climatologist and a vice president of Climate Central, a media and research organisation focusing on climate change. And she joins us live from Princeton, New Jersey. Heidi Cullen, thanks for being there. And can I start with this? How significant is this latest scientific data on this year's Arctic sea ice melt?
Tony, I think it's very significant, and it comes after a summer here in the U.S. that's been incredibly extreme, and it just shows further proof that we are seeing signs of warming across all regions. And what was interesting about this NSIDC study is that it showed that we've broken the 2007 record, and we've still got 2 weeks left to go in the melt season.
Yet revealing this new data, one US scientist put it this way. He said the Arctic ice cover used to be like a great big ice block or a block of ice, and now it's like crushed ice. In fact, he said it's like a giant slushy that's easy for storms to break up. It's a pretty colourful way of putting it, but is he right?
He's absolutely right, and I think it really shows us that the Arctic is becoming more and more vulnerable, and we know that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, and in fact, it has ramifications globally.
Yeah, with the big melt in 2007 was not attributed to global warming, but to a series of very big storms. There has been at least one big storm this season. I mean, is it possible that we're seeing simply the results of that rather than a global warming event?
Well, it's a combination of the two, and I think what was really significant about the PNAS study and the recent report by NSIDC was that the Arctic sea ice melt that we've seen, both in terms of extent and volume, estimates are that 70 to 95% of that melt can be attributed to us. It can be attributed to human activity. So Mother Nature is playing a role. These storms that we've seen are playing a role, but we are the far bigger player in the signal that we've observed.
Yeah, now when the ice is fragile like this, when it is like slush or crushed ice, is it more vulnerable to the kind of storms you're talking about? Because some scientists are particularly worried when you get large areas of sea, you get bigger waves, and the ice may break up very quickly.
Yeah, that's exactly the case. And I think what also happens is that it just begins to set up this feedback pattern where as the ice gets smaller and more vulnerable, it exposes more and more of the dark ocean surface, which just is more prone to heating, and the warming increases. So it's kind of a vicious cycle.
Yeah, can you explain the physics of that for us? I mean, are you simply saying if the ice cover is there, it sort of reflects the heat back up into space rather than being absorbed into the atmosphere?
Yeah, I mean, just think of it as a white sheet, very reflective, a dark ocean surface, dark, very absorbing. As that ice melts, that reflective blanket begins to go away, and this air conditioner, if you will, this air conditioner that the Arctic is, becomes weaker and weaker and darker and more prone to warming. And we're seeing it both in the Arctic as well as in the Antarctic.
So is it possible, stick with the Arctic for a moment, is it possible to gauge what effects that will have on weather patterns and extreme climate events potentially in the Northern Hemisphere?
Really, really big research question right now. And I think what we do understand is that the Arctic warming definitely has an impact on winters in the Northern Hemisphere. And again, it's connected to this feedback where in the fall and in the winter, as we have less and less sea ice, more ocean surface is exposed. That means more water and more moisture can go into the atmosphere, more fuel for storms. And basically, we know that Arctic sea ice plays a role in our Northern Hemisphere weather patterns, specifically when it comes to winter weather and snowstorms. And right now, the science suggests that it influences the waviness of the jet stream and also its tendency to kind of get stuck in a pattern. So what it does is it influences the likelihood of either an extremely snowy winter, which we've seen here in the U.S. as well as in Europe, or a mild winter. So it kind of pushes us into one extreme or the other.
Let me ask you this pretty obvious question, really. If it were to completely melt away or largely melt away, the sea ice in the Arctic in summer, would it actually come back in winter?
Well, as you get warmer and warmer, it gets tougher and tougher to grow back your ice sheets. So right now, scientists say that, in the coming decades, possibly as soon as 2030, we could see a summer ice-free Arctic. And that is absolutely going to make it tougher and tougher to have extensive ice sheet growth. So it's going to have impacts, absolutely.
Now, one thing we should be quite clear about here, the melting sea ice is not going to raise sea levels, but the big fear is what happens if the Great Greenland ice sheet begins to melt. Now, what is the scientific evidence about what's happening to that ice sheet? Because if that does melt, that would certainly raise sea levels.
Right. So right now we know that the poles are warming faster than other parts of the planet just by the virtue of the fact that they are at the extremes. So as the Arctic and the Antarctic continues to warm, these land ice sheets become more and more vulnerable as we see the warming increase. Greenland has upwards of 25 feet of ice stored in it, 25 feet of water stored in it. And we don't expect to see that melt anytime soon completely. Projections say that by the end of the century, we could see a meter of sea level rise increase. And basically, as the Arctic warms up, the Greenland ice sheet itself becomes more and more vulnerable, both at the surface and then underneath from melting below the surface.
And do we have any evidence of what's happening actually in Antarctica in that regard? Because we seem to get conflicting stories from different scientists about this from time to time.
Yeah, I think the recent Nature study that was published by folks at the British Antarctic Survey was a really beautiful study, because what they did was they took an ice core that took us back 50,000 years in Antarctica's history. And one of the tricky aspects of studying Antarctica is that we have very little data. Our data basically goes back to 1957 or so. But we know that specifically the Antarctic Peninsula has been warming upwards of 3 degrees Celsius over the past 50 years or so. We know there's been a lot of warming also on the West Antarctic ice sheet. So we know that the signal is there. We don't have a lot of data. But this ice core study really showed that the rate of change that we've witnessed over the past century has been really, really rapid. And the tricky part is with respect to attribution. So what caused this rapid warming? And I think the survey was very conservative. They didn't attempt to really do an attribution study, but they more or less said there's no way that we don't have an influence, that the human fingerprint isn't present. But interestingly enough, the ozone hole, stratospheric ozone loss, could also be playing a role in the warming that we're seeing in the Antarctic, in addition to greenhouse gas pollution. So it's a combination of several factors, but definitely we're playing a role as well.
OK, let's go to another study, which certainly is an attribution study. A few weeks ago, NASA's James Hansen published a new study in the official journal of the US Academy of Science. I mentioned that at the beginning of the interview. He says it actually proves that a whole series of extreme weather events throughout the Northern Hemisphere in the past 10 years can be linked directly now to global warming. And put bluntly, he says this is proof of climate change. He's jumped a long way from the sort of caution that climate scientists normally have. How's this study being received by other scientists?
Well, I think that Dr. Hansen has been very outspoken, and his work really, I think, it builds upon a body of evidence that really does show us that as the planet warms up, we're going to see more and more extreme events. And there have been really quite substantial attribution studies prior to Dr. Hansen's that really shows that there is a human fingerprint in extreme weather events that we're seeing right here and right now. And I do think that the big takeaway from this whole field of science, call it attribution science or essentially doing weather autopsies, shows us that the extreme weather events that we're seeing really are being pushed by greenhouse gas pollution, essentially, that there is a human fingerprint in extreme weather events that we're seeing right here and right now.
Yeah, Hanson's going more than a fingerprint, though. He's saying the entire cause is now clear, and he cited, as I said, a whole series of major weather events. Is it a controversial study? Are there scientists who are questioning this data?
I think that there's more work to be done, but I think that it is fairly well established that, you know, when you warm up the planet, you increase extremes, and really the likelihood of these events is going to become more and more frequent. And, you know, we know that the planet has warmed significantly over the past century, so all weather events are now born into a warmer climate, and it is just very rational to make this connection and to help people understand that the weather that we're observing today is not natural. It's partially a result of what we're doing to the planet.
Yeah, when you say it's not natural, do you think the general public in the United States is actually getting this? I mean, can you imagine, for example, a time when Oprah Winfrey would put James Hansen on her couch and talk to him about climate science? Would an American audience be prepared to listen?
You know, I do think that the past 2 years here in the U.S. have really begun to change people's minds. You know, after 2011, which here in the United States broke the record for the most billion-dollar weather disasters. We saw $14 billion weather disasters totaling more than $50 billion. We literally, on the 7th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, are seeing the landfall of another hurricane here in the U.S., Isaac. We're seeing another year of increasingly extreme weather. We had wildfires in Colorado, the drought across the United States, which continues and is already affecting crops like corn and soybeans. So the public has been very exposed to extreme weather over the past 2 years, and it is absolutely impacting the way they perceive the weather. And people are making the connection between extreme weather events and climate change more and more. And I think across the board, we're seeing folks in the U.S. really feel that there is a need to begin to address this problem. So I think we're seeing some positive change.
It'll be interesting to see if that's reflected in politics, because incidentally, James Hansen's policy solution to all of this is for the US to institute a carbon tax, as Australia has actually done, to make fossil fuels more expensive and clean energy solutions more economical. Can you imagine any US government in the future, in the near future at least, even considering such a thing?
You know, right now it really does appear that jobs in the economy are the major focus of our ongoing campaigns right now. The Republican National Convention is taking place right now in Tampa. I don't think you're going to hear much discussion of climate change, but interestingly enough, surveys suggest that the American public really does support moving away from fossil fuels and taking steps to prepare for climate change. They're making this connection between climate change and extreme weather, and I think there's support. There's unfortunately just not a lot of leadership on the issue right now.
Heidi Cullen, we're about to go to that question of US leadership shortly, on the Republican side anyway. We thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us tonight.
Thank you.